here at the International Workshop of Active Inference in Ghent, Belgium.
So I'm a PhD student in cognitive computing.
So I'm more than happy that this person doesn't need any introduction for you. So I'll just give it up for Professor Karl Friston.
Thank you very much. Oh, I can see you now. It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you. I've really enjoyed the conference so far. My job usually at this stage is to try and summarize the cross-cutting themes and celebrate the diversity of the things that we've been enjoying over the past couple of days. But Tim asked me to be more self-indulgent and reflect upon things that me and my colleagues have been focusing on in the past year. So what I want to do is just briefly rehearse some of the things that we've been focusing on, and I'm going to try to pick up on some of the questions and the intriguing issues that you've encountered over the past couple of days as I go. But there were so many of them, I'm going to forget, I'm sure, most of them. So I've noticed that Tim has given me an hour and a half, which seems a little bit luxurious. So what I imagine will happen is I'll talk for I would hope about 40 plus minutes, answer questions, and then at Tim's discretion, then segue into a more general discussion, an open discussion of the emerging themes, the retrospective on the workshop itself. So I said it's self-indulgent. It's not that self-indulgent. So what I'm going to be talking about are themes and ambitions that have been worked up with colleagues from a number of spheres, and in fact most of my colleagues are actually sitting in the audience, primarily from UCL Versus, with interest from the Active Inference Institute, and some of this work has been motivated by a commitment to contributing to IWAI standards for the next kind of message passing protocols on the web, as represented by the scope of the Web Foundation. So I've sort of identified 5 themes. The most generic theme is trying to develop an expressive and universal generative model for discrete state spaces. That model can be thought of as a generalization or a more complete kind of partially observed Markov decision process, with a special emphasis on the role of paths and how paths may or may not be controllable, the hierarchical structure and what that means in terms of separation of temporal scales, and how that speaks to what Bert was talking about in terms of reactive message passing. The specifics of what this model brings to the table, I'm going to cover in terms of developments in active inference, specifically what is afforded by having an explicit representation of paths and the notion of inductive inference, or putting inductive inference into active inference. Talking about generalizations of active learning, in the sense that active learning can be equipped with a very special meaning in the context of active inference if we look at learning the updating of model parameters as an action. And if it is an action, then it succumbs to the same principles as any other action, namely to maximize expected free energy of actions pertaining to the parameters, and we'll see what that means. You already know what it is because you've been talking about it, but it's nice to unpack it and relate it to established ideas. And illustrate active learning in the context of federated inference and belief sharing. And then finally, active selection. Again, the same notion of thinking about structured learning, Bayesian model comparison as an active process of comparing one model with another model, and again leveraging the notion that every action, every move we make, including the way that we update our models, can be expressed as a process of minimizing expected free energy. And I'll illustrate that in the context of disentanglement. So that's the idea. Start at the beginning, the nature of things and how they behave. I've just summarized that here.
Sorry, Karl, can you maybe go to presentation mode? And we can see your screen a bit better.
The free energy principle, and we've seen many, many times in different guises throughout the workshop. I'm just summarizing action and perception as the minimization of free energy with respect to action, and the optimization of the internal states representing external states, minimizing a generalized free energy that subsumes the expected free energy that has the normal interpretations in terms of expected information gain and expected utility or prior preferences. So that's the idea. It introduces the notion, one of the tenets of his account is that living systems remain organized because they feed upon negative entropy. And what I'd repeat, I'd forgotten, or didn't know, is that in the second edition of What is Life, Schrödinger states, if I had been catering for them, namely physicists alone, I should have let the discussion turn on free energy instead. It is the more familiar notion in this context, but this seems a highly technical term, or this highly technical term seems linguistically too near to energy for making the average reader alive to the contrast between the two things. So it's a real shame that he didn't use free energy, because that would have made certainly our lives easier, and possibly Richard Feynman's. So back to the Markov blanket, just to demystify that for our friends from outside the Active Inference Institute. It's just a specification of the ports, or the inputs and outputs to a system, where we are focusing on the internal organization that mediates the inputs and the outputs of the action perception cycle. And as we have covered from many perspectives, this can be characterized as message passing on a factor graph. And that's a theme that I'm going to develop. But of course, for every given factor graph, there is a graphical generative model and vice versa. So what kind of model have we been looking at for the past year? Effectively, we've been looking at a generalization of Markov decision processes that foreground the role of dynamics or control variables, or more generally paths, so that the transition dynamics depend upon a particular path. But of course, in the context of active inference and control, the paths themselves have a dynamics. And of course, the path, the next control variable, could either depend upon the previous control variable, say if I couldn't control it, or if I can control it, say I have some prior preferences that underwrite the expected free energy, then the path will change to the path that has the path of least action, or the path integral of the expected free energy denoted by G here for each given path K. So C takes on a new role here as dynamics on things that are controllable, things that I can force in terms of changing the dynamics on the velocity encoded by B. And then we have the normal Dirichlet parameterization of discrete state space models leading to this graphical model here. that has a temporal depth simply because we're paying careful attention to the dynamics in the states, and in this instance, the dynamics among or over paths here with their initial conditions and the usual likelihood mapping. To make it completely general, of course, we need to equip it with hierarchical depth. This is interesting because it brings to the table the notion that a state at one level basically entails a trajectory, a path, or a narrative at the lower level, say a spatial temporal receptive field, for example. And finally, of course, we've also heard about the importance of mean field approximation and factorization within any level and all levels of a hierarchical generative model, both in terms of the paths and in terms of the hidden states. So we have three characteristic kinds of depth to these deep generative models: temporal, hierarchical, and factorial. That hierarchical structure has, I think, an interesting interpretation in relation to the temporal depth, because by construction, it's difficult to imagine how else you would construct it. What one is inducing in this hierarchical structure is a separation of temporal scales, in the sense that a state at one level maps to a path that has some universal clock time associated with it at the lower level. Then an instant at the higher level corresponds to a chunk of time at the lower level, or a sequence of discrete events at the lower level, which necessarily means that the deeper I move into my hierarchical generative model, the more I progress towards the center, things slow down. And I've tried to cartoon that here in terms of the updates over time that will proceed relatively slowly, or you encounter less changes as you get deeper into the model, and more changes at the extremities or the periphery of the model, the external Markov blanket, as it were. So that's, I think, a useful theme, which I'll just briefly recapitulate in a couple of moments. But let's just look at the corresponding factor graph. Magnus is going to be very cross with me because this is another slide that does not conform to the normal standards. I'm sure it will forgive me. So here's the equivalent factor graph with the random variables, the states and the paths on the edges, and the factors of the conditional probability distributions associated with these various tensors parameterized by Dirichlet parameters here. And then, given this generative model, it is a simple matter just to write the update rules. There's no wiggle room here. They all fall out of the kind of universal or message passing scheme that Bert was talking about. This is in fact just based upon variation-free energy, giving you in some instances a mixture of belief propagation and variational message passing. I won't bother going through them, but other than to note, they rest upon a very small number of operators, maybe important from a computer science point of view, basically tensor operators, sum product operators, and a couple of nonlinearities. And in fact, I just listed all the nonlinearities you would need here, just a handful of nonlinearities, nonlinear morphisms, and tensor sum product operators, and that's it. This should, in principle, be applicable to any given generative model you had in mind in discrete state space, and would thereby allow you to build generative models if we have the right kind of software package. And we are moving towards those with things like RxInfer and Collins PyMDP. One interesting twist here is just to think about where is agency and where are agents, and is this hierarchical generative model a composition of different generative models, or is it one big generative model? Agency in this context inherits from planning, in the sense that if an agent has agency, she has to imagine the consequences of her actions. That is slightly distinct, I think, from controller's inference that we heard about in the last presentation, which you get a long way with. But in active inference, we're moving to planning as inference with an explicit model of the future, where we score the quality of our plans in terms of the expected free energy. And we know the form of that from the pathological formulation from the free energy principle. And because we know the form, we know the dependencies or the messages that we need from other parts of the graph in order to constitute the expected free energy that underlies the selection of particular plans and implicit agency. And interestingly, it falls down to ABC. So I'm just making the sort of conceptual point, which may or may not be pragmatically useful, that an agent just is a collection of A, B's and C's, but it can be embedded in a much deeper hierarchically structured graph. And I've illustrated the kind of graphs that we have in mind that may be a useful metaphor for, say, transactions, message passing on the graph, where the graph is now conceived of as, say, a web or an internet, Web3. So here's our little subgraph here with the agents here, and I've just squashed it here and then arranged it in this deep hierarchical form, just to give a visual impression of how one might conceive of federated inference and belief updating among multiple agents, where each agent is associated with a particular subgraph, such that certain agents inherit beliefs from other agents, even though they're actually looking at very different kinds of data at different part of the world. And it's interesting to think about what would happen if you had lots of these deep graphs, in this instance a factor graph, that were equipped with shared Markov blankets, so that they could talk to each other and exchange. And we've heard some suggestions about this in terms of the implications for generalized artificial intelligence and belief sharing. From a purely physics perspective and academic perspective, what should happen is that this kind of system will find its joint free energy, and that just means, from the point of view of the physics, it's going to evince a generalized synchrony. So everything is mutually predictable in the sense that free energy just is surprise. The average surprise is minimized when everything is mutually predictable. So we're looking at a kind of harmony that is a free energy minimizing solution that can have many readings. And here's a reading by my friend Takua in terms of Bayesian filtering that ensues from this kind of organization as a model of social intelligence and communication. So I'm going to now just run through 3 different levels that we've been focusing on in terms of active inference, learning and selection. First of all, this is focusing on one particular aspect of having paths at hand, or having a particular focus on paths. And the ability to now think about the way that we prescribe endpoints of these paths. So from the point of view of a physicist, you would normally describe a path in terms of the initial conditions in which you prepare a system and the endpoints. And then you normally worry about the distribution over paths between the two. And indeed, that's where the variation of free energy from Richard Feynman came from, in the context of quantum electrodynamics. But from our point of view, it affords each the opportunity now to think about specifying the endpoints of paths as intentions or as intended goals. So I've sort of euphemistically describe this in terms of, if I know that I'm here, then therefore I think I should go there, but only if I know where I am going. And we can derive a very simple, a very effective kind of backwards induction from this sentiment, cartooned here in terms of, if I know all my allowable transitions in this context, and I know where I'm going to end up, then I know all the states as I back up in time that afford me access to the final state. And if I know that, I know which states to avoid. If I know which states to avoid, I can work out how close am I to my goal. And if I'm here at this distance from my goal in time, then I know where not to go next. And what we can do is we can just simply put that where not to go next into or add it to the expected free energy with a large negative number and preclude directions of travel that I know preclude finally attaining my desired endpoint or my intended endpoint. And this can be written down in terms of logical or inductive inference very, very efficiently, affording very, very deep planning, which is basically not choosing the best route to a desired endpoint, but really avoiding any states that preclude me actually ending up at that endpoint. I'm going to illustrate this kind of putting inductive constraints on active inference based upon the expected information gain and the expected utility, i.e. the expected free energies. And that hasn't changed. It's just now we're constraining these inductive constraints. So the obvious one is getting to locations in some complicated maze that we've already seen examples of this. So we start off with exploration, using the expected free energy to maximize our information gain about the parameters of the structure of the unknown world, usually leading to a deterministic and Bayes-optimal, in the sense of optimal Bayesian design, interaction and navigation of my environment, covering all options, learning where I can and cannot go. And once I've done my effectively planning to learn, in the sense I am choosing those plans that have the greatest expected information gain. Why have I done that? Well, I can now learn to plan and find the best routes to my intended goals. And I've illustrated that here in terms of a couple of examples, just to make 2 points. The first point is that there are 2 kinds of ways of specifying good paths. So the prior preferences or the constraints or the cost that we are used to that underwrites the expected free energy, or certainly the risk component of the expected free energy, can be regarded as basically constraints in terms of which parts of state space I do not occupy. So they put constraints in the path that are in play throughout the execution of that path. And this should be contrasted with the notion of an intended goal state indexed by H in the previous slide, which is just about the end point. Where do I halt? I'm illustrating that here. So under the same intended states here, I've got some strong constraints, prior preferences here for not transgressing black parts of this maze, and weak constraints. So just to illustrate the different kinds of route planning that one can evince from this combination of putting inductive constraints on, in this instance, sophisticated inference, showing that there is an interplay between preferences described in terms of constraints and preferences described in terms of intentions. The other point I wanted to make is it's interesting to note that the constraints we define in active inference for good reasons in outcome space. Those good reasons are simply, if you haven't yet learned your generative model, there is no state space to specify your goals. But if now we are sufficiently learned or developmentally mature, and we now have a generative model that frames and scaffolds a state space, we can now instantiate some instructional set of some intentions or specify them from a high level of a generative model in state space. So when I talk about inductive constraints on sophisticated inference, what I am implicitly saying is within this learned generative model, I can now pick out certain latent states, hidden states that I want to end up in, and then leverage in this instance, the expected information gain and pursue Barringer's inference under constraints to attain that particular goal. And this is an interesting distinction which speaks to different kinds of sentient behavior. So you can imagine certain organisms, indeed you can imagine thermostats, complying with the principles of controller's influence. So they can be very expressive thermostats, and you can simulate handwriting and walking and the like. But there now is a bright line between intentional behavior based upon the endpoint of a particular plan versus those based upon prior preferences, say a prior belief that I am walking or I am talking based upon some itinerant attractor or orbit in my generative model. We wanted to go back and revisit an illustration of free energy minimization in real neurons in vitro on VASP. It was published in Neuron last year. That it was claimed showed sentient behavior because they learned to play Pong. So Brett Kagan and colleagues in Australia basically put electrodes into a dish of neurons, supplied it or stimulated some electrodes, endowing this little in vitro neural network with information about the configuration of a game of a Pong in a computer, but also had other electrodes picking up signals from the neurons that were capable of driving a paddle. And the fond hope was that this in vitro neural network, biological neural network, would learn to play Pong. Why? Well, because whenever it missed the ball, either any feedback was withheld or random feedback was supplied. So under the premise that the neural network was indeed self-organizing under the free energy principle, it wouldn't like random, unpredictable or surprising input, and therefore the only way to avoid that was to hit the ball back. And indeed that's what it did. But the question is, to what degree could we find any evidence for intentional behavior? Did it intend to hit the ball, or was it just avoiding constraints implied by the preferences to avoid surprise, namely avoiding not hitting the ball? So we simulated this in vivo neural network in silico, in vitro neural network in silico, to see how quickly it would learn to play Pong and compare it with the actual learning. And what we did, so initially, this is the first 500 exposures, and what you can see whenever the ball hits the bottom row, there's a sort of white noise, visual white noise that the agent cannot predict, and therefore will always be irreducibly surprising. But as time goes on, it does actually engage in a few rallies, where each rally entails a return of the ball for between 2 and 6 returns. Very, very much like the real neural network. But then we continued the simulation and saw this kind of behavior under this inductive inference. So after about 500 exposures, this is a single epoch with just 500 data points, it starts to learn to gracefully play Pong. And in so doing, both minimize surprise in terms of avoiding this random input, but also in this instance, we actually told it at this point, hit the ball. These are particular states, basically you've got to be in contact with the ball because it had learned a suitable generative model illustrated by the likelihood mapping and the transition dynamics of the previous slide. So the neural networks never showed this behavior. They only got up to here. They never went there. So in our little jargon, they were sentient, but they were certainly not intentional. So you could say that they showed control as inference, but not planning as inference of this inductive sort or intentional sort. Good. Same kind of, exactly the same kind of learning and active inference deployed using the same code and the same inversion routines, but in this instance in terms of the Tower of Hanoi program, a little game where you have to move these balls around on pillars to match a target configuration, and you can make it easy or difficult depending on the number of moves to get to this arrangement. In this instance, there are 4 moves. It can learn the model in terms of the likelihood mapping and the allowable transitions among the different arrangements of these balls, and then we can switch on this kind of inductive inference, and in so doing, move. So this was sophisticated inference with just 1 step ahead. And it's not too bad, provided you give enough time to work towards the desired or the required arrangement of balls, and you can even solve problems up to 4 moves ahead on occasions. But as soon as you switch on this inductive inference, it gets 100% performance up to 9 moves ahead. And it's actually looking, in this instance, 64 moves ahead, but you can go much, much further in the future should you want to. Active learning in a particular context, and this context was established by thinking about how one could deploy this mechanics, this kind of Bayesian mechanics at scale in terms of distributed cognition, ecosystems of intelligence, and implicitly federated inference. So my focus in this example is going to be on communication. How do you share beliefs among this federated and deep graphical structure where agents are now subgraphs within this generative model of itself and the external Markov blanket. So to anthropomorphize this, I'm going to use a game hide and seek. So imagine there are 3 daughters or sisters playing hide and seek with their mother, and their mother's moving around trying to hide behind this and that. And the key thing is, each of the sisters can only see a limited field of view. They can move their eyes around, but they can only see a limited horizon. And that horizon is distinct for each of the 3 sisters. And the idea is, can we see or can we demonstrate the improvement in active inference or the resolution of uncertainty and implicitly free energy if this sister can hear her sisters? We equipped each of these agents with visual and auditory modalities. The visual modality had sort of high resolution for real representations and low resolution peripheral vision, in addition to proprioception, where they were looking, and auditory, basically these sounds emitted by the other 2 and with any given sister herself. A very simple generative model. I've just written out the first few lines of the MATLAB code describing the generative model for each of the 3 sisters. And then basically this is what happens. At the top, this is what one particular agent would actually see through her various visual modalities. This is what was being presented, what the agent could see if she could see everywhere, and this is what the agent thinks she is seeing, noting that she can only actually see a very limited field of view at any one time. So our question was, what would happen if each sister broadcast their beliefs by uttering the location of the mother? So just say a word that indicated their posterior belief about the location of the mother. And we simulated that simply by using precise and imprecise likelihood mappings to the auditory modality and illustrating the results of being able to federate belief updating through communication, through articulation, through language, if you like. And I've done that here, we did that here, in terms of beliefs about location. So these are the beliefs of the 3 agents, with and without language or communication. The belief of the first agent is very precise because she could actually see her mother, but the other 2 agents couldn't. But what they can do is listen to what the first sister is saying, and resolve their uncertainty and form very precise beliefs, even though they've never seen Mum at this stage. And we know that because when we remove this belief sharing, there is a lot of uncertainty about the location of the mother until the mother is actually visualized, because that's the only sensory evidence at hand to resolve uncertainty about Mum's location, and one can score it in terms of the free energy differences. An interesting, so that's the setup that was motivated by an illustration of the utility of sharing beliefs amongst multiple agents. We had another agenda in mind, though, in setting up this particular game. The agenda was to demonstrate the importance of active learning. I repeat, active learning has a very particular meaning in this instance. It's treating the notion of updating parameters of a generative model as an action. And it is an action. The probability of doing it should be in proportion to a softmax function, the expected free energy of doing it, relative to the expected free energy of not doing it. So now we introduce the notion of the expected free energy of a parameter that is acted upon through an update. And here's the update. We've heard about the importance of heavy and associative learning and active learning. In discrete state spaces, this is really trivial. It's just the pre and post synaptic activity of posterior probabilities multiplied together. And then that provides the update to the weight or the parameter of, in this instance, the likelihood mapping. And what we are saying is that we can either update or not, and score the probability of updating in terms of the differences in the expected free energy of that parameterization. So what is the expected free energy of the parameterization? And it's really simple. It's just the mutual information that is constrained by our constraints or by our preferences. And I think this is a really important observation, because what it says is that all learning, at the end of the day, is just in the service of maximizing the mutual information, not just on the likelihood mapping, but also on the transition dynamics and anything else that constitutes the generative model. And of course, the estimate of a mutual information, certainly in discrete state space models, is where each column of a mapping or morphism has one element and zero everywhere. So it entails sparsity. It just means that the expected free energy of learning is just the drive towards a sparse, non-redundant, high mutual information, high efficiency mapping, I repeat in this instance, a likelihood mapping or morphism. It's not quite that simple, so there has to be a constraint, and we actually heard about explicitly the constraints on the sparsification or the maximization of mutual information. Those constraints in active inference are just supplied by the constraints that shape the kinds of states that you would expect to find this particular system in. So when one does that and works through the maths, you have a sort of very simple rule for updating. And what basically that does is, it means that I'm only going to update if this is the right thing to do in terms of maximizing the marginal likelihood of my model, or the free energy of my model, and if the mutual information, constrained mutual information, is increased. If we now, to go back to those three agents, those three sisters, and start off with a random likelihood mapping between their concepts, their posterior beliefs about hidden states, the state of the world, and their articulation, their belief sharing, so that they know no language. And then we just let them listen to each other under this particular kind of active learning. Then what emerges is a high mutual information that is shared. It's shared because they're all jointly producing the same beliefs. So the only predictable exchanges that afford a high mutual information mapping are a shared acquisition of the same language. So that the words, the articulations, producing the auditory sensations mean the same thing. And this is an emergent property, this language is an emergent property, simply out of maximizing the expected free energy of the model parameters or the mutual information that's cartooned here in terms of the convergence of parameters and reduction of free energy and due to inference and learning, and the slow increase over 400 to 500 exposures in terms of mutual information. And so finally, moving on to a similar idea, but in this instance not in terms of updating the parameters, but actually updating the structure of the model itself. What that leads to is the notion of active model selection, where we use something that's underwritten statistics for a model comparison for decades and decades, based loosely on the Savage-Dickey ratio. You may recognize this as its generalization in terms of Bayesian model reduction. And all we're doing here is saying that there's an active plane. And the active plane, do we equip my generative model with another state, another factor, another level to a given hidden state? Answering that question, I say, well, what happens to the expected free energy, or what happens to the marginal likelihood, or the model evidence, and under the assumption that the two likelihoods, likelihoods are the same. No, not under that assumption, but under the assumption that we have some particular priors about whether this new observation warrants or is likely or not. I can then evaluate the relative probability of two models and decide whether to update or not by comparing the model evidence for this new observation by comparing two models with and without an extra latent state or level to a latent state, a new path or a new factor of latent states, each equipped with, in the first instance, just one path identity matrix or stationary mapping and two levels to it. So I'm illustrating that in probably the simplest application here, which is just in a static context, just trying to classify or carve nature up to its joints in terms of identifying how many species are there. If I was an ecologist or an evolutionary theorist, or in this instance, how many species of handwritten digits are there, in terms of the style in which I can write any one particular digit. So all we're doing here is only updating our model by adding a new style for any given particular digit if this condition is met. And that's what's meant by active model selection. And we can control that with a species discovery prior. Plays the same kind of role as all the stick breaking processes and, say, Chinese restaurant processes that you would find in non-parametric Bayes, a little bit simpler in this instance. And I can accumulate thousands and thousands of observations of handwritten digits here, the youngest data set, and work out how many different styles there are. And once I've done that, I've got two factors. One is the class, the number class, and the other one is the style class. And here I think there were 256 different ways of writing certain numbers. Other numbers, only about 50 ways of writing them. That's actually number one here. And doing that, you can, or having grown your model, the kind of Bayesian model expansion based upon this active selection, one can then look at the learned or the acquired or accumulated information geometry by looking at the information that's approximated by KL divergences between different classes and different styles, and proceed in the normal way in terms of clustering, in this instance, different numbers. Finally, taking the same notion but now into dynamics, where now the way in which you grow the model, the way in which you deploy this active model selection, you're accommodating or making a decision in the face of any new bit of data. Do I augment the model or not? If I do augment the model, how do I augment it? Do I add another state? Do I add another path to any given factor, or do I actually add a new factor? It transpires you can simplify that and develop a kind of structured learning that depends upon the sequence in which you present data for assimilation for the agent to make a decision about whether to grow or expand the model or not. With a relatively simple curriculum, so I'll just summarize this in narrative form here. So if this is the very first thing I see, I'm going to create a right-hand mapping with a single state and populate it with initial Dirichlet counts, namely the concentration parameter of a symmetric Dirichlet distribution. And then for every other observation, I'm going to consider an additional state in the last factor, provided there's only one path, and that path is by design a stationary path, a path that you just remain in the same state. Otherwise, consider an additional path or factor, and if I'm putting a new factor in, then it's going to clearly have just two states with one stationary path, because the third state is a state of the previous factors that is required to link different factors together. And when we use that kind of, well, it's almost structured teaching really, because you have to be very careful about the sequence in which you present the successive data points that are being assimilated. Not too careful, because it's exactly in the order that the dynamics of the real world are presented, but still you have to actually be careful when you're simulating this. We can now do structure learning of the kind that could be read as a very elemental disentanglement of sprites here, yes, the sprites themselves are just summarized here. So in this particular example, the world could contain one of three different kinds of objects, and these objects could move around. Just to make things interesting, we actually equip the agents with prior preferences for locating each of the three different kinds of sprites to different quadrants, following the work of colleagues Zach and others, Kent. Usually the preferred locations of each of these objects were different. I repeat, each object can move up or down or sideways or both. But the agent didn't know that. The agent was completely naive. In fact, the MDP structure, the Markov decision, or partial observed Markov decision process was never actually specified by hand. It was automatically grown just by feeding it data that had been generated from a process that had already been learned. What it can do, or what it should do, is basically learn receptive fields for vertical and horizontal positions and the map of preferred locations that will ultimately cause it to draw these sprites to the locations. And indeed it does, using this. So this is the learned, auto-assembled, self-created structural learning in terms of the likelihood mapping that's all been concatenated for visualization, and the different transition dynamics for each of three factors. So it's learned there are three factors, and basically these three factors are things can move right and left, or they may not. They may not be moving, or they can be moving up and down, or not moving up and down, and there can be three kinds of things that are moving left and right, or up and down. And it's also learned the preference mappings here. This just scores the number of times each of these areas, each of these locations were revisited. I should say an important part of this kind of structural learning is after a time, the agent autodidactically makes moves to fill in the gaps, a bit like motor babbling, based upon those actions that maximize expected information gain about the parameters. So once it's got the structure, in terms of the number of factors and paths within each factor. So number of factors here, number of levels for each factor, and the number of paths for each factor over the columns here. Once it's got the structure, then it can sample the way to fill in the tensors on the basis of informed epistemic moves that are chosen on the basis of the expected free energy, or I repeat, the expected information gained by the parameters, and it learns exactly the right receptive fields and the likelihood mappings. And this is the final slide. It just illustrates the kind of learning that you get. And evinces something that we see at least twice, if not three, if not more times throughout the presentations during the workshop. This systematic progression from exploratory behaviour to exploitative behaviour. So this is the number of trials during this epistemic foraging, during this, if you like, motor babbling, that show that initially it requires, as one might guess, given this was a sort of 9x9 visual scene, it requires about 81 exposures to start to fill in all the important gaps here, during which time the expected information gain is very, very high for each of the three sprites here, with the evidence lower bound here going up and down during this exploratory phase. But after it's learned, and notice it has very precise beliefs, it's very confident, just to pick up on one of the presentations, it's very confident, it has a low entropy distribution over policies, or over where to move the sprite on each time step during the exploration phase, because it knows what is epistemically, has high epistemic affordance, and therefore makes very confident epistemic moves initially, and then as it becomes familiar, the expected information gain falls, it starts to lose some confidence in terms of the precisions, and settles down to a reward-based exploitative pattern of behaviour, and just maintains the sprite over its preferred direction, and becomes bored, presumably. And that's it. That's a brief whirlwind tour of what me and my friends have been doing in the past year. I'll close with Einstein. Log evidence is basically simplicity plus accuracy. In other words, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Just to sort of recapitulate that in terms of planning as influence and the expected free energy, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. Indeed, I would argue that existence just is the expression of curiosity. So that just remains again for me to thank all my collaborators. Their affiliations are shown along the top here, and I repeat, most of you are in the audience anyway, so you know exactly who you are. I'd like to thank you for your attention, but just take this opportunity just to thank Tim and the organisers for this opportunity. I was touched that Tim was thanking me for attending. I thought it was quite incongruous yesterday, because I was really enjoying myself, sitting here, admiring everything, having a cup of coffee and smoking with gay abandon. So thank you very much. I'll pass the chair back to Tim now.
Anyone has a question for Karl?
Thank you very much for that talk. I'm interested in this adaptive structure learning that you're doing, and I wonder if you could speak a bit on the idea of, I've come across the fact that disentanglement doesn't always necessarily give you strong generalization abilities, and I wonder if you could perhaps talk a little bit about how you might necessarily be able to do adaptive structure learning and making sure that you're getting a real causal structure as opposed to any spurious structure.
Excellent question. I think just a broad answer, and I'm sure other people will come in with their perspectives on this. The broad answer is that this kind of structure learning based upon building a model from scratch is quite fragile, and it's certainly not the way that biotic or biomimetic at least structure learning would work. You'd normally use basic model reduction and start off with something that has the right kind of structure that's usually overexpressive, overconnected as like a baby's brain, and then reduce it in the right kind of way, fit for purpose for this particular lived world. But you could still ask your question, what happens if I go through my period of basic model reduction or neurodevelopment in one world, and then the world changes dramatically? How do I then adapt to this new world? And then one might argue that we need some kind of mixture of recurrent basic model reduction and basic model expansion. And indeed, if you're a biologist, you might argue that's exactly what we do in terms of various mental cycles, but also what we all do every day in terms of our sleep-wake cycle, that we do our basic model augmentation during the day. We acquire excessive and exuberant associative connections through heavy plasticity during the day, and then during sleep we do the basic model reduction. There is no accuracy term to worry about, so maximizing marginal likelihood or the elbow or minimizing variation-free energy just is minimizing complexity by removing redundant model parameters. And just I forgot to mention that there was a really interesting presentation, it might have been penultimate presentation, where somebody was asking the presenter, well, if you've removed the environment, how on earth is it going to ask questions about itself? And it did strike me that was like putting it to sleep. You can still optimize a model in the absence of any new veridical data, as we've known since the inception of the object Hinton's wake-sleep algorithm. And your view through the lens of structuring and basic model selection, this is a necessary part. You need some offline period in order to minimize the complexity, so you're not worrying about maximizing the accuracy. So I would imagine that just having basic model expansion in and of itself, by itself, from scratch, from if you like, an embryo or a single cell, just will not work. I think you have to put it together with basic model reduction. However, if you wanted to do it, then you're absolutely right. It would just learn that world structure that you exposed it to. And if you changed it, it would have a suboptimal in the sense of model evidence generative model. And this, I think, places strong emphasis, I repeat, on the curriculum of the data that you present, because the order, the sequentiality, the ordinality of the data is absolutely crucial for learning the dynamics, and much of the disentanglement rests upon the dynamics. So if you don't present things in the right order, it will never learn the right kind of model. And in so doing, because this order really matters, very much like curriculum learning in machine learning, or in education at least, you sort of freeze what you've learned up until now, if you want to introduce a new level, or a new factor, or a new path. So you can't go back and undo what you've already learned. So again, very much like education, it's very important you educate and teach in the right order and build upon what has been learned so far. So that would be my intuitive answer. But I repeat, I'm not sure that this kind of basic model expansion is going to be sufficiently robust to be a generic tool. It might be. Perhaps Chris Buckley would like to comment on that.
We're going to try.
So thank you for the presentation. It strikes me that you presented the universal generative model. From what you showed in your presentation, there were potentially two ways to go about it. Either you go from practically a mold of a generative model that grows through structure learning into what it needs to become, or you have a massive generative model where everything is connected effectively through some kind of attention scheme. You just prune away to what you need at any given time. And then you showed the active learning of language, where it seemed like you were starting from something that was extremely noisy, and through the collaboration of different agents, or federated learning and active learning, you could bring your agents to coalesce on a shared model, and therefore we could assume that you could use this to determine kinds of separations of a part of a universal generative model to make kinds of agents for kinds of purposes. So what approach do you think would be best to get to a universal generative model relative to these different approaches? And if you were to use active learning, how would you structure a system that could get from active learning to the right kinds of agents for the right kinds of purposes from a universal generative model?
I think in the context of, if you like, assembling federated models, large structures, what you are basically asking is, how do I plug in a new model into an existing ecosystem? So again, this very much speaks to what I was trying to intimate before, that learning a new model de novo is probably not the way that sort of biometric systems self-organize. I assume that's I can't see you, but I recognize your voice. If it's not my apologies, but if it is, I mean, what we're talking about here, as you will know, of course, is sort of the circular causality implicit in niche construction, cultural niche construction in the context of language, that enables that kind of belief sharing and language learning that I illustrated. Now notice that in the illustration of that belief sharing, the agents had pre-formed or learned generative models of their lived world. All they had to learn was the mapping between their beliefs and what they said, how they shared those beliefs. So this speaks to a general theme that you're sort of scaffolding a particular kind of learning in this instance, and I think this is the focus of your question, learning about the meaning of other people's utterances or messages or cues or language in relation to my own beliefs. So the belief sharing rests upon or that particular kind of active learning is a way of literally plugging in or integrating one generative model into a network or a federation or an ensemble of generative models. And the place in which you plug it is going to be very interesting, because if you come back to that sort of circular structure, that centripetal deep generative model with the clock rotating around, then certain agents will be quite slow agents and other agents will be very, very fast agents. So it's got to find its place not only in terms of being able to share beliefs with its siblings and either assimilate data that only it can see in terms of likelihood mappings and discern and choose the right, I think Bert used the word subscribe to the top-down empirical prize from the level above. So the belief sharing we're talking about at the moment is horizontal within any level, but it's also got to find the right level. So if it's a very slow agent, if it's the kind of agent that does, say, climate forecasting, then it's not going to be able to talk to the kinds of agents involved in traffic flow maintenance in smart cities. So, part of this active learning will not only be, but the active learning part, I think, will be very important, is automatically learning the way that you exchange with your conspecifics at any particular level. But possibly the Bayesian model comparison will be very important in finding what level you as a part of this subgraph, or you as a subgraph, and you could be artificial, you could be real, you actually fit into this distributed distributed kind of message passing. Is that the kind of answer you were looking for?
Yeah, I can imagine that based on what you're suggesting, you could just split the model of different product points, try to make them fulfill a task and see how well they perform, and then learn the proper breakpoint for the models to fulfill X given task.
That's certainly true. Again, I'm mindful, we have seen an example of this before in terms of convergence that depends upon the precision. So another phenomena here that would, I think, eschew having to, sort of dissect out or reposition an agent would be the observation that under Bayesian model selection and parametric learning, then because of this observation that the joint free energy of, if you like, the ensemble and the new individual is when they are mutually predictable, then there will be a generalized synchrony, which necessarily entails that there is an isomorphism between the generative models that the new agent can see of the ensemble and the new agent. So there's a convergence. The new agent will, the child, if you like, or the novice, will come to install the structure and the parameters of the environment in which it finds itself. But of course, that environment is actually another agent, and in fact, partly a sub-agent of a larger ensemble of agents, provided that the agent has more precise beliefs. So the degree of convergence, I think, the degree of convergence of agent to environment as agent depends upon the relative precision of the beliefs. In discrete formulations, those precisions are encoded literally by the number of Dirichlet counts. So a baby agent will have very, very small Dirichlet counts. So as soon as you start adding counts, their relative probabilities change very, very quickly. So they're very impressionable. An old, wise agent that's been around for a long time will accumulate lots of Dirichlet counts, and adding one or two here or there will make very little difference to their belief structures and their morphisms or likelihood mappings. So depending on the relative amount of precision of the two agents, the impressionable agent will come to adopt that of the teacher, or the wise agent, or the old, or the mature agent. So it may be that an agent can actually adapt to any particular scale or any particular exchange, provided it is sufficiently impressionable. But we are talking here. Sorry, just a nod to Connor's work when he was talking about the symmetries in terms of learning rates. You can always interpret a learning rate in terms of precisions. So what he was talking about in that instance was a precision there articulated in terms of how quickly do you accumulate your precise Dirichlet counts. So that symmetry versus asymmetry is really important in terms of whether you get this cooperation or defection. More generally speaking, it's always cooperation. It's moving towards the synchronization manifold, but the degree to which any one person moves depends upon, or agent moves depends upon, the relative precision of their beliefs relative to the other beliefs. Notice what we've been talking about here is just parametric learning, though. It's not structural learning. That's probably a more vexed problem.
Any other question?
I have a general question. Hi, Karl. So this is just more of a general question, but last month, as I'm sure you're aware, a research team in Japan at Riken published a paper that offered that they had achieved experimental validation that the free energy principle is indeed how neurons learn. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts to share on that, in regard to that.
Yeah, I think that must be the work of Takua, who I mentioned during the presentation. So the work on the the in vivo neurons playing Pong. That was with Brett Kagan and colleagues in Australia. The Japanese group have done a lot of led by Takao Asamura, have done a lot of the foundational conceptual work using in vivo neurons, taking a number of steps, providing empirical evidence that indeed agents were behaviours, if your in vivo neural networks behaved as if they were minimizing their free energy. But the most definitive account of that, I think, is available in the paper you just mentioned, which was a beautiful piece of work. A little bit involved, if I remember correctly, in the sense of what they had to do in order to assert that these in vivo VNNs, biological neural networks, were indeed minimizing their variation-free energy, was to first identify the generative model that these neural networks have of their sensed world. Because the variation-free energy is only defined in relation to a generative model. Or more specifically, the free energy gradients require a generative model. So that's something which is often overlooked in terms of applying the free energy principle to biological systems, and indeed your people. I'm thinking about the application of the FEP or active inference to computational psychiatry. It's not easy to work out what generative model anyone's actually using. But they were able to do that for these neural networks just because of the simplicity of the way that neurons talk to each other, and by appealing to artificial neural networks. So they were able to take canonical forms for biologically plausible neural networks, deep neural networks, or recurrent neural networks, and then work out what the implicit generative model was, in actually using a discrete state space model, if I remember correctly. So that they were able to, if you like, identify or reverse engineer the generative model of a very simple world. It's basically yes, no, or kind of world. Is the world in this state or is it in that state? But in so doing, they were now able to look at the empirical inputs and outputs to this in vivo neural network, infer the generative model and its parameters quantitatively, and then the validation enabled them to take those quantitative parameters and precision parameters and then work out how quickly it would learn and how it would respond to perturbations to various parameters in the model, or changes in the parameters of the model that were associated with particular sort of pharmacological interventions. So the remarkable thing, which is not obvious, and it is remarkable. They were able to get it into the literature so easily, I think. But the key thing they were able to do is basically say, I now know how this in vitro neural network will respond in the future. I now know how it will learn because I've completely parameterized its generative model. And under the assumption it's going to minimize its expected free energy in the future, I can now determine its learning rate, what it will learn, how quickly it will learn, and how that learning will be perturbed by various psychological interventions. And that's what they use as a validation of the free energy principle. So, a lovely piece of work, based upon at least a decade's worth of work. It may not be apparent in the paper, but I do know, because I know the first author, how much is invested in that.
Any other question?
Karl, yeah, it's a bit of a strange question. So, the beauty of the free energy principle is this kind of commitment to base optimality, which leads to all this lovely machinery. But lots of us are trying to sail close to from the algorithmic into the computational barriers, right? So how do we implement this at a scale, particularly in artificial intelligence and so on? I just wonder what you feel about that. So you can think about that in terms of how brain is it, and you can also think about it about how we do it in silico. And those might have different suggestions about the implementation. I mean, my general question is, is that kind of staying close to the hardware and the constraints something that will give back to the algorithm level, or do you feel it's separate? So the Bayes optimality is somehow free from the implementation. And what is that discourse between the two? So just to give motivation for this question, Jeff Hinton recently said that he no longer considers the brain a source of inspiration for AI and backpropagation. If the brain could do backpropagation, the brain would. We should no longer consider neural systems as somehow inspiration for us to construct artificial systems. So this is, I wonder if you can answer that kind of area question.
It sounds like you want me to answer Jeff's challenge there. Also, Jeff is responsible for the notion of morphical computation recently, which you're very familiar with, which was speaking exactly the opposite direction, I think. I'm sure you've got your own views on this, and I'm going to pass it back to you to articulate them. But my view on this is that the brain as an inspiration and a commitment to biomimetic implementations is a principled approach because we are the existence proof of the emergence of this kind of self-organization, and it is scale-free. I wouldn't be here without my parents, and my parents wouldn't be here without the welfare state or a culture, and the culture wouldn't be there without the biosphere and Gaia, and also myself wouldn't be here without me. So it's important to remember that you cannot just build AGI in silico. It has to evolve in a context that itself complies with the right principles, and so on and so forth. So I'm pretty sure that the principles are generic, and the principles do emphasize the sort of being attendant to the neuromorphic constraints, in the sense that the whole point of building a generative model is that it has some kind of structural isomorphism to the world that you're exchanging with. So if you pursue Jeff's argument to the limit, then what he is saying is, well, if I want to build some kind of intelligence that is not able to exchange or assimilate or accommodate biomimetic intelligence, then yes, I can free myself from the constraints of neuromorphic imperatives or biomimetic imperatives. But I don't think that's a workable agenda. Putting it the other way around, is it likely that in the future the ecosystem as we know it and of which we are part, it will no longer exist, and it will have been replaced by in silico intelligence? If the answer is no, then that means that the kind of intelligence that you're having to build has the degree of generalized synchrony isomorphism in time and in space with us, with you and me. And if that's the case, then it has to be biomimetic, and therefore the structure matters. The structure of the message passing, the timing, the temporal scheduling, all of that matters in the spirit of the good regulator theorem, provided you remember that it has to actually interact, it is open to the ecosystem in which it is embedded. So that would be my pushback against Jeff's challenge. Do you have a pushback, or do you agree with it?
I don't know. I'm sympathetic to what you said there. I guess there's the end product of the AI system and how you get there are kind of different things, right? So you can take the backpropagation route to a system, and then how does that affect the end structure that you achieve? I don't think, in principle, that we couldn't get something that was biomimetic by ignoring lots of the processes that we get in biological systems. For example, do we have to have a full evolutionary process before we can get something that truly has generalized synchrony with a biological agent? I'm slightly doubtful about that, but I also think he's maybe simplified it a bit too much. I I do think sitting at the boundary of the computation, we're going to learn a lot. So one thing I worry about is that Bayes in all systems has to be under constraint, right? So the optimality of Bayes is constrained by the medium in which it is implemented, and that's going to have important implications for the types of systems and even our own behaviour. Which diverge from the Bayes optimality.
Absolutely. And just to pick up on that point, just again trying to link it with discussion of controls inference as you know, and the distinction between having sort of a biased model of the world versus a real model of the world. I think your last point sort of really highlights and foregrounds that issue. I mean, I would argue, with my hat as a data scientist, as a modeler of brain imaging data, I would argue that Bayes just is the right way to implement constraints. So normally you only recourse to Bayes in the context of ill-posed problems that are only solvable through the imposition of constraints. So Bayes is a mechanics of constraints. And indeed the generative model in the free energy principle just as an expression of the constraints on the kinds of states that this particular particle or person can occupy, that are characteristic of that person. It is all about the constraints. And just again, trying to pick up on some really interesting themes. That also, I think, hits you in the face when you take Dalton's perspective on the free energy principle as dual to the constraint maximum entropy principle of James. But notice the emphasis on the constraints. So from my point of view, the constraint on the max entropy principle just is the generative model that says it has to be like this, and it has to interact like this. So what that means is that the free energy principle just is a constraint maximum entropy principle where all the interesting stuff is in the constraints, because the entropy is just what it is. You can easily measure that. We've seen that measured under Gaussian substitution numerous times in the presentations. It's all about the structure of the generative model that affords those constraints. The link I want to make is to the rate distortion theorem, which again I see as just another instance of James's maximum entropy principle, or the free energy principle, and as beautifully articulated by the presenter. The rate of distortion just mapped very, very gracefully to a bipartition of the log marginal evidence, or likelihood of log model evidence, into accuracy and complexity. It's all the same thing. And yes, you can call it Bayesian. You could actually articulate the free energy principle just by using the language of James or the language of Shannon in terms of rate distortion theory. You could articulate it using gauge theory. If there was any sense in which can you wander away from Bayes, I would say absolutely not. Is there any sense that you can wander away from neuromorphic implementation? Then that's, I think, a more subtle question. If it's an implementation of neuromimetic computation, I would say, yeah, absolutely. Can you wander away from neuromimetic implementation? Processing. I would say no. I would say no for the reasons that I just articulated. Can you give us an example of lots of people with their hands up?
Hello, Karl. I was wondering, do you imagine a world which minimizes only the expected free energy and not variational?
And then again, do you
imagine a world which minimizes only the expected free energy and not the variational free energy?
Well, Steve, no, I can't.
Maybe because you were in some IWAI type presentation was in this direction.
So from a physicist's point of view, the expected free energy is just part of the overall free energy. But the way it was unpacked in the presentation was just to make it clear that the expected free energy sort of plays a role of a prime. in physics, it sort of comes out of the pathological formulation as a probability distribution over the active states, over the the actions of something. For precise, for particles that don't show many random fluctuations. But it cannot be realized or indeed computed in the absence of paths and implicit distributions over everything else, including the external states, the internal states. So expected free energy is jolly important, but it's not the only thing. No.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So Karl, do you have any concluding remarks?
Well, I'm looking forward to who won the poster. And Tim, did anybody miss the vote?
Yeah, Martin collected all the votes, so he knows.
I meant the vote yesterday. You're so worried about people missing the vote.
Everybody got the votes.
Absolutely. I was sitting very worried in the UK so yeah, thank you very much. Again, it's been amazing. I've sat here and I have been thanked for sitting here glued to the screen, listening to all these ideas. I'll just reflect. I mean, normally I can summarise 99% of what's been said. What has happened in the past couple of years is that I can't anymore. This whole field is moving in so many different directions. I think it's almost impossible for any one person to have an expert overview on what's going on. So more and more I am finding I am learning stuff. So I just wanted to say that, which when you get to my age is a bit frightening. But I suppose that does speak to the importance of the next generation of people coming in and taking up the mantle of pushing the envelope forward. And that pushing, I think, has been beautifully evidenced in the presentations and in the youth and fresh ideas that have been showcased in the presentations. I will finish, because this is probably my last opportunity to say anything, but I repeat, Tim and your colleagues and the person and the people who've allowed me to and other guests to actually participate online. I just wanted to thank you for all your energy and organisation and good humour in being the architect of this workshop. So thank you very much.